بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be here with you all in this beautiful city, which is really the heart of the world and heart of the Muslim world, and reminds me of it reminds us all of the great Islamic history to which we're heirs today. And my topic today is against impossibility. And because I want us to engage in a discussion about the idea of the Ummah and about the idea of obstacles, the hurdles that face the Ummah, I will make a very simple categorization, a cartoon, a caricature of the obstacles that face us in the form of three objections that are presented to the idea of Muslim unity. And then I will talk about how we should approach these obstacles and objections. The first objection that is often presented to the idea of an Islamic state in the modern world is by my good friend Wael Halak. He presents this argument of his famous book, The Impossible State, which made quite a splash in the academy, which is, one might say, an idealist argument. The argument is that the Sharia is too good for the world that we live in today. The second objection is the opposite, presented by secularist Muslims who argue the opposite way, that the world is too good for the Sharia. And there are many versions of the argument, and I'll present one simple one, which is that when you talk about Muslim unity, you are excluding non-Muslims, you're excluding secular Muslims, you are excluding those people whose identity is not primarily Muslim, but those who happen to be Muslim. So it's an exclusionary idea. This idea falls into the category of things like the clash of civilizations, meaning that the world is divided into X number of civilizations, 5 or 6 or 7, and that both Western Orientalists, colonizers, hawks in the West, people like Samuel Huntington, and Islamists, whether those Islamists are the Sharia Islamists or jihadist Islamists, or maybe they're Ottoman idealists, the number of versions, they both agree, even though they may be on the opposite ends of the spectrum, they agree on one thing, which is that the world can be divided into different sections, and that these different sections are ideologically incommensurable. They want different things. These civilizations have to stay separate, and to think of Muslim unity is therefore to sabotage the idea of human rights, the universal human being. So that's the second objection, which is that to think about Muslim unity is to exclude the idea of universal human rights, universal human unity. And the third objection that is often presented is not a high-minded idealistic objection like the first two. The first two are, in my view, more academic objections that are both interesting. In my view, they're both worthy of engagement for Muslims, if for nothing else but to enrich our argument and our self-understanding and understanding of the argument that Ummatics stands for, and the vast majority of Muslims find themselves sympathetic to this idea. So these two objections are idealistic. In my view, they don't represent the real world, they represent the seminar room. And I'll explain why. But the third objection is the most difficult one, because it represents much more the real world, which is the objection that it is simply impossible for reasons that are not to do with some ideals, but has to simply do with the fact that human beings are divisive, human beings are vociferous, and people are much more likely to be driven by nationalism, ethnocentric ideas. You're much more likely to be driven by and go to war for Turks versus Kurds, or Pakistan versus Afghanistan, or some other version of an argument that nobody likes to mention in the seminar room, but that is what truly drives a lot of actual politics. This includes sectarian hatreds, whether it's Sunni and Shia, but understood in very concrete way, not really Sunni and Shia, but more like Arabs versus Persians, or you can go and think of this in any number of permutations. That it's this kind of politics on the ground that in the West is very much ascendant, right? The white ethno-nationalism, the revanchist movements, white nationalism, and so that's a third objection. Now, how do I respond to, or how do we think about these problems? The first one, the Sharia is too good for the world, it is meant to be a provocative argument. And it is based on a profound and critical reading of the modern world. Of course, we inhabit a modern world which is fundamentally unsustainable in a very material sense. And while Halak makes a compelling argument in that book, The Impossible State, as well as his subsequent books, that the Sharia is fundamentally a moral paradigm, meaning it thinks of the world in terms of what human beings ought to do, and that modernity is a paradigm that is born out of a separation, a divorce of two questions: the question of what is and of what ought to be, the is-ought separation, and the question of what we ought to do versus whether there is a God. They are separated. So in the political sphere, that means that we're going to go ahead and construct a politics, a society, a set of social relations, independent of the truth, independent of who your God is, independent of who created and who is going to, if anyone, going to hold you accountable. You separate that question because that question is divisive. And so that's where secularism, right, a fundamental secularism at the heart of modern understanding of the world is born. But it's those two questions that you start by saying, I'm going to live this life regardless of what I should live it for. I'm going to live this life, I'm going to design this life, I'm going to design a politics, and then in the privacy of your homes, you could have your own private religious beliefs, whatever you want. The problem is that once you start with that separation, you can never put those things back together again. And that's the challenge of modernity. And as a result, modernity is not accidentally, but fundamentally and essentially a destructive force. That's Halak's argument. I'm sympathetic to this argument. The problem that Halak has is that when he discusses modernity, he is very critical. But when he discusses Islamic history, he is very idealistic. And one of the things that he leaves out is the role of politics, the role of power in Islamic civilization, in the creation of this moral paradigm. This paradigm always has needed and will always need the engagement with this imperfect world. In other words, he presents the Sharia as morally superior, but somehow constitutionally so weak that whenever the optimal conditions are taken away from it, like an unfit organism, that is in a species that is not fit for this imperfect environment, it goes extinct, right? So this kind of understanding is, I think on the one hand, it works well as a foil to critique modernity, but does not do justice to the complexity and the resilience of Islam. The second question, which is that you have to choose between Islam and human rights. A version of that argument is made by Jamil Aydin, Professor Jamil Aydin, who will be sharing my panel this weekend at the conference. He has a well-known book called The Idea of the Muslim World, where he argues that the idea of the Muslim world was invented by the Ottomans for political reasons, and that, as I said earlier, that this idea of civilizational entities that are separate from each other, that are somehow hermetically sealed, that they can interact with each other, but they are definable independent of each other. This idea is not compelling, and that it goes against human rights. The challenge, of course, with this is that modernity, this idea buys into a simple self-understanding of modernity and of human rights. You can look at both the anthropological existence and the actual performance of human rights as an idea, which is so fundamentally whenever one talks about human rights, one cannot but also talk about hypocrisy and inconsistency. So either you understand human rights as a kind of an asymptotic ideal that can never be reached, because it's always in breach that we find the invocations of human rights, meaning that all the winners of the First and the Second World War, they are the ones who always get human rights. They are the ones who always get to talk about human rights, and they are the ones that get to beat everyone else with the stick of human rights. So if that is the case, that either the human rights are an impractical ideal, almost a sacred ideal that should be upheld because it's not practiced in the real world, or there are some people in the world that are in fact deplorable and disposable, that it is a world divided the way it should be. And if it is the case, as the idealists will argue, that it is just an asymptotic ideal that you can never approach, but that precisely is the definition of a God. That is the definition of religion. That you know that you can never be as perfect. Nevertheless, this ideal is what we are created for, and we must aspire to it. Of course, the human rights discourse has no foundation any longer after modernity has lost its self-confidence, meaning that you cannot talk about reason with capital R anymore that Europe discovered and on the basis of which we can replace religions. With that gone, and the episteme of the modern world is so fragmented that liberal theorists argue openly, and nearly one might say this is a consensus of liberal theorists, that human rights have to be believed in because they cannot be rationally proven. The idea that it's a self-evident truth that all men are created equal or all human beings are created equal is a fiction, because throughout history it is not self-evident that all human beings are equal or men are equal. In fact, empirically, the exact opposite is the case. Human beings are different and unequal in almost every way we can imagine. So the idea that all human beings are equal is a religious belief, which comes out of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. It's not an idea that is found in nature through empirical observation. So what has happened is that this discourse on human rights, because it is what I call levitating ethics, it is a levitating idea, it has no grounding, and because it is levitating, it's in the air, groundless, it is necessarily open to abuse. In fact, it is simply there for the highest bidder to use. But that said, can we not simply dismiss the idea of Islam as an identity and say that let's practice Islam in private life, and simply aspire to this new religion, the religion of human rights. And I will submit that that kind of idealism is found mostly in the seminar rooms in Western universities, and it's always used by those in power to, in fact, create the real solidarities that do exist, that are concrete, which are based in self-interest. That solidarity of wealth, or solidarity of the 1%, whatever elite in the world, so we do find that cross-cultural solidarity between the billionaires in every country, for example. They all have private jets and all enjoy vacations in the same places, Monaco or whatever, Beverly Hills. They do live very similar lives. So that kind of solidarity does exist, but it is neither moral nor acceptable to anyone, whether religious or not. So the third challenge is what I really want us to think more with and about, and that is the idea that it is our very narrow solidarities that really drive human beings rather than these big ideals. I remember last time I was in Istanbul 2 years ago. I spent the summer here a year and a half ago, and I remember I was, we were talking about liberalism. I did a lecture on that, and one Turkish sister who was very Ummatic, but she was also very confused. She said that, look, in the world in which I live, she lived in Istanbul for education, but came from central Turkey. She said, liberalism is not at all why Turks will oppose anything like Islamic unity. Liberalism is not the reason why Turks hate Syrians. And so the real problem is much more ethnic, much more simple ethnic worlds or subcultures in which people live. And those are the reasons why you can look at any Muslim country or any Muslim borders between two Muslim countries, and you'll find tensions there that are not driven by some kind of great ideological divide, but for reasons that are very parochial. And so my response to that is that, of course, we recognize that is the case, but once we identify that is the case, that is not so much a moral excuse for living in a particular way, but rather a hindrance to peace, hindrance to prosperity, and a hindrance to a decent life. And that's precisely why Muslims, and I'll end with this comment by Samuel Huntington, which was related, this conversation was related to me by John Esposito, a well-known American scholar of Islam and a very sympathetic to Islam. He said that he argued with Samuel Huntington about Islam and why do you speak of Islam in such derogatory terms, because he writes in his book that Islam has bleeding borders. Everywhere Islam interacts with the rest of the world, there is blood, whether it's India or Israel or the West and so on. And so Esposito took exception to that, and he said, this is offensive. So Huntington said, well, if anything, I held back in the book, because what I meant to say, what I should have said, that Islam's borders are bleeding, but its innards are also bleeding, meaning everywhere within Islam, currently, there is blood between these various ethnicities, whether it's the Arabs or Persians or Turks or Kurds or Pakistans and Afghans and so on and so forth. And so the challenge then for Ummatics, in my view, comes back to a simple concept that I find in the Quran, and it goes back to the verse that my brother recited at the beginning, and a companion verse that is often recited with it, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold on to the rope of Allah all together and be not divided. And what I often find interesting and inspiring is when I think about this verse, there are two commands, but really there is one command, which is that it's not possible to hold on to the rope of Allah except by doing so together. And that doing it together is not a separate command, but it's one single command. And to the extent that we fail in coming together and solve the problem of solidarity and unity, for us to holding on to that rope becomes harder and harder by the day. And this was the case at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Muslims were commanded to come together to fight, and to have faith, and the same remains the case today. So inshallah, that is the mission of the Ummatics Institute, and I'm very glad and uplifted when I talk to Muslims, young Muslims, and not so young Muslims around the world. And I'm glad that you are here. Thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to a conversation. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Sure, alaikum salam. Very good question. I'm actually just writing a piece on that, and that inshallah will be published soon. The way of change in a very fundamental way is Islam. Islam as a Sharia is itself inclusive of a manhaj, a method of change. So one way to think about that is in Islam, every individual that practices the Sharia is like a seed that has the entire DNA of Islam as an ummah. Whenever one person, you practice Islam, you practice the 5 pillars, and you honor your parents, and you give charity, and you have an immediate solidarity to anyone who says La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, unless you are somehow obstructing some aspect of Islam, naturally Islam is going to bloom into that tree. So I see that what the Ummatics Institute has to do, and what any da'wah, any organization has to do, is really just identify what are the obstacles, identify what are some of the ways in which this tree of Islam has not fully bloomed. But that said, there are 3 key methodological points that I'm going to make about Ummatics Institute. The first one, we start with the premise that we live in a moment in history today where there is a lot of revival and reform in almost every part of the Muslim world. As a historian, I can tell you this is not usual. This is unusual. That the amount of interest in Islam, the amount of literacy, and the number of Muslims in the last 100 years has 10x'd in the world. 10 times more Muslims than there were, say, in 1910, the census that was done at the time. There are 200 million Muslims, now nearly 2 billion. And as a percentage of Muslims in the world, that has also gone up from about 10% to about 25 to 30%. So in many ways, Islam is thriving, and this is precisely the reason why the pushback against Islam is so significant. But that is the first thing that Ummatics, that we start by recognizing that there are a lot of revivals going on in the Ummah. There are many Islamic movements, many madaris, many scholarly movements that are in place. So in that sense, I start with a premise or a evaluation of the world that is almost directly opposed to what my good friend Wael Halak starts with. I don't think Islam is dying. In fact, I think it is unusually alive in our individual and communal lives. And I say it sounds, again, strange, but you have to know history well to understand what I'm saying. So I can answer that if you are interested. The second point is that what we therefore need to do is to connect these revivals and acts of or attempts at reform throughout the Ummah. There are all kinds of inequalities and reasons for isolation within the Ummah. So the key point is what I call discursive integration of the Ummah. And what does discursive integration mean is the creation of if you will, an ummatic public sphere. And that's, I think, a very powerful thing, and it's something that needs to be done constantly because reasons for isolation and misunderstanding are everywhere. But we live in an unusual moment in history in that we're able to talk across distances and across, and of course, ironically, it's the English language in many ways that has allowed, and the hegemony of the West, the United States, Anglo-American hegemony that has allowed Muslims everywhere to be able to at least talk in the English language. This kind of linguistic sociality was not really possible in the Muslim world for a very long period of time. So creation of this common public sphere. And the third element of this manhaj, if you will, is accept that there is always going to be unexpected and unpredicted change that is coming from within the Ummah elsewhere. So whether it's Gaza, or whether it's Syria, or Turkey itself, the Islamic turn in Turkey in the 90s and so on. All of these are unpredictable things that no analysis could have taken into account. That being the case, the issue so much is not in creating a particular line of a rigid trajectory of change, but rather the challenge is to respond to these opportunities that are constantly arising and build an ummatic, one might say, a memory, a brain, a heart, so that, if you will, whether it happened the Arab Spring or Bangladesh or Gaza or Assyria, these bodies of knowledge that are produced, the experiential knowledge, they remain part of our shared memory and our shared conversation. So these are the concrete ways in which the Ummatics Institute wants to function, which is, if you will notice, is very much an inclusive and pluralist idea. The idea is not that there's only one way, that one must belong to one jama'ah, one group, but rather because there is this great plurality of efforts within the Ummah, the key is to take advantage of that and connect them.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I just wanted to ask about, maybe you can further clarify how historically unique our point in history is, because we tend to see it as quite dark, especially with the wars and all that. Yeah. Also, I was just going to ask about two other things that were in terms of, you mentioned linguistic integration, like we're ending up speaking in English, and because many people point to the fact that the Ummatic kind of unity disappeared after the alphabet of Arabic alphabet was, especially like in Central Asian countries and all other countries. So the alphabet and language was kind of torn apart. So would you say English has definitely has the potential, but do you think it's going to be able to carry this linguistic integration mission? Also, I think historically speaking, trade and economic integration was a huge part of just Ummatic unity. So maybe you can touch upon that point as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so why do I see our moment as historic today? Well, modernity is a major development in human history. Right? And materially speaking, material inventions, whether movement of people and sharing of information, organizing of information, modernity, there are many things that have never happened in human history that have occurred. So that's one reason. On the whole, organizing of human beings into states itself is a relatively new development, and at such a large scale. But connectivity of people, particularly in this last phase of globalization since the 1980s, the movement of people and goods and information is just unprecedented. And that has benefited Muslims in a remarkable way. It has also harmed Muslims and challenged old forms of Muslim power and tradition, but at the same time, if you look at last 200 years and look at the capacities of Muslim capacity in any in political organization or communication, we are an unprecedented place in the world, in the sense that we have more, if you name any particular field, Muslims are among the experts, have expert knowledge in the way that was not the case in the last couple of centuries. So access to those capacities is remarkable. Similarly, wealth. Muslims today have a larger share of wealth than we had in the last couple of centuries. Since, say, when the British took over India, from 1757 to 1857, India has drained the amount of wealth that's available, whether it's oil wealth, but also increasingly globally mobile Muslims have more access to resources, knowledge, and technological know-how than before. So that's what I meant. Now the question of English, the English language, I see the English language as midwifing rather than being the goal, the end goal. Because this very possibility that Muslims can recognize that other Muslims exist and their conditions are very similar to ours, that their stories are similar to ours, that itself, that knowledge, and then the need that there is, there is recognition that there is this opportunity, this possibility, and that we need to go back to our roots. That itself is a very modern feeling. People who are living in the tradition, they don't necessarily feel they're losing it. I'll tell you an anecdote which I find very telling in that. I remember I was in Saudi making Umrah at the time when the clock tower was a relatively new thing, and it just absolutely offended me and hurt me, and I was angry about it. That you have a building that sort of dwarfs the Kaaba. And so I was complaining to a friend about it, and I remember some Pakistani villagers were passing by, and they said, "What are you talking about? This is the greatest thing we've seen. People, the police, look at, they're nice to us. Police in Pakistan is never like that. And look how things are clean. This is never the case. This is the house of Allah. Look what they have done." And I recognize that this very sense that I have of this great loss of history, it's only possible because I know history, because history is available to me. The traditional people did not live in a way that history is available to them in an objective form. History is available to them in a very different form. So my point is that it is usually through this recognition and this shared sense of loss and shared need to conserve that a need for Ummatics is felt. So that's what I mean, what the English language has made accessible to us. But I do recognize that, and I think that it's also the case, by the way, more non-Arabs are learning Arabic today than has been the case almost ever in recent history. So I'll stop there. Really good questions.
So thank you for your speech. And my question will be about what you said, actually. You mentioned solidarity and that we need to stick together to the rope of Allah. Okay, when you said that, something came to my mind. I made a comparison, actually. So we know that in the Western world, individualism is promoted a lot. So people are encouraged to do things quite alone, or let me just say in a self way, like, how can I say that in a word? Okay. In the popular psychology, nowadays it's so popular to do things on your own. So you are kind of promoted the system makes you believe that you are self-sufficient. You can do it on your own. You can do whatever you want. You are enough to yourself, etc.
No.
That is, this mindset is quite against to, from my point of view, it's quite against to Eastern collectivism, right? So we live in a collectivist social world. So I think that this idea of individualism has a kind of effect on our communities. And I would like to know your opinions about this issue. Like, do you think that this social mindset affects the way like we live that we try to stay together as Ummah, but we have challenges?
Yeah.
Do you think that could be a reason, or what would you like to say?
So is individualism a reason why ummatic unity is hard? I think it is a reason, it is not the reason. That's because I think that, as somebody who lives in the West, I think people depend on the collective and the government and on big organizations more than people do in what you're calling Eastern cultures. Yeah. Right? So people, in the sense, they're more uniform, more homogenized, their opinions are more standardized when they think they're more individualistic. So really, individualism in the West is more of a state of mind. It's more of an ideology, but not reality. Mm-hmm. In reality, they are very much collectivized. And so the question really is simply, how are people depending on each other? What are the modes? And I believe that the Sharia strikes a balance between something like, one might consider, I'll give you an example of Hinduism as an example, where mobility and individualism are perhaps most severely opposed. You must believe that where you're born, you must always be there. You should never try to be better. If you're untouchable, born untouchable, live as untouchable. There's no improvement in life. That's almost an extreme, and the other extreme is modern capitalism, where mobility and individualism and not being encumbered by your natural condition is the virtue. Islam is very much in the middle, in that we stand before Allah alone as individuals. Right? So Islam is methodologically individualistic. One of the things that if you read fiqh, you find that fiqh is very much concerned with the individual. Even when it talks about the ruler, it talks about what the ruler has as responsibility, because they will stand before Allah. So even collective responsibilities are understood in individual sense. Yet at the same time, our connection and our dependence on other people is regulated, and most importantly, our reverence toward our parents and rights of families that tone down some of that. So I think that what is needed is not so much to consider or think of individualism, modern individualism, as like a unique discontinuity or rupture or incompatibility with Islam. Because I think Islam is more incompatible with Hinduism than it is perhaps with modern America. But the practicing of Sharia itself, I think, brings that balance. So I agree with you that is a challenge, but I don't see that as a unique challenge.
Apologies in advance if this question was answered. But again, on the topic of solidarity, and thank you so much, it was very enriching, by the way. But the topic of solidarity, and when you were speaking about one ummah, is like in my mind, I don't know if this is hadith life or not, but one hadith that came to my mind is the one that says that Prophet spoke of like the ummah being divided into 73 sects. And it's like, if we're working towards one ummah, how can we also overcome like that thought of like there's division within the ummah itself? And there's always this like, because you mentioned Shia and Sunnah at some point, like we see them like lashing on each other, for example, on social, like us away from
Right.
wars, but like even in social media, the
Absolutely.
way we see him fighting that I'm right and you're wrong and I'm right and
Yeah.
you're wrong, like it's like how can I like put that hadith away
Yeah.
and kind of try to approach and believe that we're gonna be somehow one ummah that overcomes all these divisions.
So I'll tell you, it's not easy, certainly. But if I can, easy question is that hadith. So that hadith is interesting because it's used by almost everybody to make this argument that there is one firqa najia, one sect that is of the 72 or so sects. And scholars, in the past have done different things with it. Now, what's interesting is that the first part of that hadith that says there are 71 or 2 or 3, sects, that part is agreed on. Almost everybody agrees it's authentic. The one part that says, but all of them are in fire except one, that part is disagreed on because there is not a single authentic chain to it. So if you take it that way, if that is a good solution, unfortunately the hadith, the fact that this is a scholarly, if you will, analysis of it, that doesn't actually help the fact that all sects do use it. Salafis, of course, use it, but I was just looking at recently other literature, and I found that almost everybody uses it. Even the Shia have a version of it, they use it. And in fact, the Shia are much more likely to say that other Muslims are in hellfire. Be that as it may, from a hadith criticism perspective, the last part that is not authentic. Although there are hadith scholars who will say that because there are so many narrations of it, it together becomes sahih. The problem, of course, is that that principle itself is questionable in hadith sciences. But sectarianism is a serious challenge. We're in fact going to publish on that question and we are working with Shia and other scholars on this question. The best way to look at this is that these beliefs become a problem when they are politically manipulated. So there is a term that scholars today use called sectarianization, not sectarianism, but sectarianization. Sectarianism is, you could say, an age-old problem. It is a problem, and we can talk about why, we don't have time for it, but sectarianization is when it's instrumentalized. And everywhere you can look at the history of how these differences are instrumentalized. So it is quite possible, in the way what I argue is that in the seminar room, Muslims should be able to argue against each other. But when does it become so that you will make alliance with non-Muslims, people that you know, that you argue and you claim are completely misguided, people who do not recognize La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, you will ally with them against other Muslims. When does that happen? Because it's illogical, but that's the logic of sectarianism. Sectarianism is not to say, look, the Shia are wrong or the Sunnis are wrong. Sectarianism is to say, I would rather ally with Jews and Christians against Iran or against Saudi because I hate these people so much more. This is a psychological phenomenon they call, what is it, the small differences. What's the phrase I'm looking for? Freud invented this or coined this term, narcissism of small differences. That human groups really are much more interested in affirming small differences than big differences. So that people that are very close to you, like 90%, you're much more likely to affirm that 10% or 5% of your doctrine that separates you from people that are very similar to you. But the big difference is people who are completely different you in fact don't care that much about them. You'd be happy to hang out with them, do a barbecue together or something. That's a very American reference. But if you are with somebody who's kind of mostly like you, but they differ on one thing, it's an impulse to emphasize that. So that's what sectarianism, and I think that's sectarianization is certainly a challenge.
It's not a question, it's just a very quick comment. When you said that it's a psychological phenomenon and it's just it's just the tendency of people to focus on the little differences. But I think that's a simplification of the fact that there's a political reality to this that has backed by a lot of injustice and blood. That it's a psychological phenomenon is a simplification of the reality, that's the political reality that just justifies a lot of injustice and bloodshedding in terms of the sectarian differences. I mean, like, for people who live this reality, it's very difficult for them to just kind of like focus on the La ilaha illallah that binds us together, because to them you have broken that contract of La ilaha illallah when you have just participated in bloodshedding of your and then the non-Muslim who is more just towards your case becomes closer, not because of just psychological, I don't know, it's not a psychological phenomenon. It's just, it is part of me being a Muslim to just be able to differentiate between who claims to be under the umbrella and who is not. I'm sorry, I'm
okay.
I'm Syrian.
Yes, you're Syrian. I totally understand that. So historical accumulation is part of the challenge. When I say narcissism, small differences, that's there's like a whole theory of how sectarianism builds up. And history becomes part of the problem, but then in every generation, this historical sectarian separation has to be maintained. So there is a whole theory of how sectarian separation is maintained by creating certain narratives of separation, which does not mean that injustice is not real. And not at all. I'm not saying that at all. The problem is often that everybody can recite a list of grave injustices by the other side. And then the key choice that has to be made is that the injustice that you did was because of this reason. Right? So these are all narrative choices. So for example, when it comes to Iran's involvement in Syria, there are at least 3 different explanations that scholars talk about. One is that it is Iranian statehood, that's what's important. The other is that it's Persian essentialism, Persian nationalism. Other Shia say that, by the way. So one of the founders of Hezbollah, Subhi al-Tufayli, is one of the most articulate and loudest critics of Iran and what Hezbollah did in Syria. He is not only Shia, but he's a pro-Khomeini Shia. So for him, Khomeiniism, Shiism is not responsible for it. It's rather Iranian, Persian nationalism is responsible for it. And then there is a theory that this is because of Shiism. But in Shia theology, right, what's interesting is that 12ers do not consider Alawites actually Muslim. So does sectarianism explain all of that or some of that? That's what I mean, that all of this has to become part. So I'm not saying that injustice is not real, but whether this construction of the narrative and these causality is that's where the problem happens. But thank you for that comment. I totally understand that. Usually I have to stop people to say, no, sisters have to ask a question too. But alhamdulillah, in this room...
Last question. I couldn't attend the main part of the conversation. Apologies for that. But in one of the answers to the questions, you were talking about being ally with non-Muslims against the partners. Like when you say that, you mean at the political and state level, or in our personal life as well, being an ally or friend to the non-Muslim against our Muslim friend or brother or sister, you mean only political and state level alliance?
So I was not talking about that issue generally. I was simply giving an example of what that psychological phenomenon means. That if you feel that somebody is relatively close to you and yet they attack you on something that's very dear to you. Like somebody's attacking Umar and Abu Bakr and Aisha and Fatima, right? Or Aisha. That's radiallahu anhum ajma'in. That is just very close, very personally offensive to a religious Muslim. On the other hand, somebody is saying that Ali was not, the conduit to heaven, and he was not the most important person in the world. He was not like the source of salvation. He's just the fourth caliph. It's like you were personally offending me. My point is that that offense is felt more in the psychological phenomenon than if somebody just says, well, I don't believe in Muhammad to begin with, alayhi salatu wassalam. You're just different. So now whether the question of political solidarity versus psychological, I didn't really talk that much about that. But of course there are examples of all of that in our history. Persian, in the case of both Safavid and Ottoman, this was a major thing that Safavids were allied to the French, I believe, at the time, and the Ottomans to Austro-Hungarian. And throughout history, this remains the case today. In fact, I was just recently reading Saudi scholars who are arguing, using hadith, in fact, misusing hadith, but they were saying that the Prophet even predicted and commanded that Muslims should join with Christians to fight against Iran. It's a creative reading of a hadith, but the point is that this is a very, very common sentiment in the Muslim world, and on both sides. So this is both available both in writing and in speech as well. I don't remember the name of the scholar, but it's a common argument. They would use a hadith. The hadith, if you were trying to look up the hadith is that the Prophet ﷺ said that in one of the hadith when he's talking about end times, that Muslims will join with Christians to find something or to fight something that is something that is beyond. The hadith does not name what is beyond, but that alliance would quickly fall apart. But anyway, so the scholar, what he says is that, well, this other thing is Iran. Yes. So